What if your favorite Harry Potter character isn't brave or evil or quirky? What if they're just mentally ill and nobody in the wizarding world ever bothered to check? So today we're putting every major wizard in Harry Potter on the psychologist's couch. J.K. Rowling didn't just write a fantasy series, she wrote one of the most psychologically detailed character studies in modern fiction. And the clinical psychology running through these pages is so precise, it's almost like she had a psychiatry manual open on her desk. The DSM-5, the book real psychologists use to diagnose mental disorders. Every wizard, every villain, even the awkward kids fumbling through Hogwarts. They all carry a real diagnosable psychological profile that explains everything they do. Why they're afraid, what they choose, who they betray, and how they find redemption. All of it tracks back to actual clinical psychology. And today we're breaking down every single one of them. Let's start with where it all begins, with the boy who lived. Harry Potter doesn't just have a tragic backstory, he has post-traumatic stress disorder, and not the vague, hand-wavy kind people throw around casually. Harry meets every single criterion for PTSD as defined by the DSM-5. But here's what's even more clinically accurate. Because Harry's trauma wasn't a single catastrophic event, but a prolonged, repeated pattern beginning in childhood. Many psychologists would actually classify his presentation as complex PTSD, or CPTSD. Quick translation, regular PTSD is when one horrible thing happens to you. CPTSD is when life decides once isn't enough and keeps hitting repeat. Which is exactly what Harry got. 10 years with the Dursleys and a bedroom under the stairs before he ever set foot in Hogwarts. Criterion A requires direct exposure to a traumatic event involving actual or threatened death, and Harry meets that criterion every single year he attends Hogwarts. He watches Cedric Diggory die right in front of him in Goblet of Fire. He nearly dies himself more times than most people can count. He faces Voldemort repeatedly, knowing each encounter could be his last. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember how everyone complained about Harry in the Order of the Phoenix? How he was suddenly this angry, irritable, snapping at everyone teenager, and people chalked it up to hormones? That was textbook PTSD, rendered so accurately it fooled readers into thinking it was bad writing. The irritability, the emotional outbursts, the distancing himself from friends because he believed proximity to him would get them killed. That's avoidance behavior, emotional numbing, and survivor's guilt playing out in real time. Harry watched Cedric die and internalized the belief that people around him are in danger simply because they're around him. He pushes Ron and Hermione away because his traumatized brain has concluded that closeness equals death. And then there's the truest erosion. Harry grows up in a cupboard under the stairs, neglected and abused by the Dursleys, then enters a world where every authority figure is hiding something from him. This is where attachment theory, developed by psychologist John Bowlby, becomes essential. Bowlby's research showed that children who grow up without consistent, reliable caregivers develop insecure or disorganized attachment styles, fundamentally altering how they relate to everyone around them for the rest of their lives. Harry never had a secure attachment figure in the Dursley household. The result is exactly what Bowlby predicted: hypervigilance, distrust of authority, and profound difficulty accepting that anyone will consistently show up for him. Dumbledore withholds critical information year after year. The Ministry of Magic gaslights him. Even Snape, a teacher who's supposed to protect him, seems to despise him. So, when Harry starts questioning Dumbledore's motives in the later books, that's a trauma response dressed up as teenage rebellion. Repeated betrayals by authority figures create hypervigilance and distrust. And Harry develops these patterns because his experience has taught him over and over that the people in charge cannot be relied upon. Now here's the twist that makes the entire series work psychologically. Harry and Voldemort share almost identical origin stories. Both are orphans, both are raised without love, both discover they're wizards and enter Hogwarts as outsiders. The difference is what they choose to do with their pain, and that brings us to the darkest mind in the wizarding world. Voldemort is not just evil. Rowling herself has called him a psychopath, and she meant it clinically. Tom Riddle displays every hallmark of antisocial personality disorder. In Muggle words, hurting people and feeling nothing, combined with narcissistic personality disorder. believing the world exists to serve you. And together with the Machiavellianism we'll discuss later, using people like chess pieces, he forms a textbook example of what psychologists call the dark triad, all three operating simultaneously in a single individual. The dark triad is one of the most studied constructs in personality psychology, and Voldemort is essentially its fictional poster child. Manipulation, lack of empathy, zero remorse. Superficial charm used to extract what he wants from people. Dumbledore identified instincts for cruelty, secrecy, and domination in Tom Riddle when the boy was only 11 years old. 11. Before Hogwarts even began shaping him, the patterns were already there. At the orphanage, young Tom bullied other children, stole from them, and used early uncontrolled magic to intimidate and harm. Clinically, this pattern of behavior in childhood, persistent aggression, cruelty to others, deliberate rule-breaking, would meet the criteria for conduct disorder. Basically, the childhood version of psychopathy. A pattern of cruelty and rule-breaking so persistent that psychologists flag it early. It's actually the DSM's required precursor diagnosis before antisocial personality disorder can be formally applied to an adult. He collected trophies from his victims, a behavior pattern disturbingly consistent with real-world psychopathic profiles, and Bowlby's work on reactive attachment disorder is also deeply relevant here. Tom Riddle's early institutional upbringing, raised without any consistent loving caregiver, matches the developmental pathway that produces the most severe attachment disruptions. As he grew, his narcissism became the engine driving everything. Voldemort's overwhelming sense of superiority, his conviction that he was destined to rule because of his bloodline and magical power. These aren't just character traits, they're diagnostic criteria. He views other people as tools or obstacles, and the concept of guilt is literally foreign to him. But what makes Voldemort fascinating from a psychological standpoint is that his core motivation has always been fear. His greatest fear is death, and everything he does, the Horcruxes, the murders, the obsessive quest for immortality, all of it is an elaborate avoidance mechanism. He cannot tolerate the idea of his own mortality, so he tears his soul apart trying to escape it. In clinical terms, his entire life is one massive maladaptive coping strategy. And this is exactly why Harry defeats him. Harry accepts what Voldemort cannot. Harry walks into the forest in Deathly Hallows willing to die. Voldemort could never do that. That psychological difference is the entire point of the series. Now, let's talk about the most psychologically complex character Rowling ever created. And no, it's not Harry or Voldemort, it's Severus Snape. Snape's clinical profile reads like a case study in persistent depressive disorder, what psychologists call dysthymia. This is a form of chronic prolonged depression that colors every aspect of a person's life. Snape doesn't want to let go of the past. He lives inside his tragic memories, carrying pain he can't share with anyone. So he hides it behind coldness and severity. But it's always been a mask. The roots of Snape's psychology trace back to his childhood in a violent household, where his father was abusive and his mother failed to protect him. He entered Hogwarts already carrying deep wounds of feeling unloved and unwanted. Then was bullied relentlessly by James Potter and Sirius Black, which cemented an inferiority complex he never recovered from. And then came the defining trauma, the loss of Lily Evans, the one person who had shown him genuine kindness. Her rejection wounded him, but her death destroyed him, because he was the one who delivered the prophecy to Voldemort. From an object relations theory perspective, Lily became what psychologists call an internal object, a psychological representation of love itself that Snape could never fully release. Lily became the organizing center of his entire emotional life, the one loss he built every decision around. What makes Snape psychologically fascinating is his duality. His trauma produces both destructive and protective behaviors simultaneously. He bullies students, particularly Neville and Harry. He's cruel, petty, and bitter. Yet, he also risks his life every single day as a double agent, protecting the son of the woman he loved and the man he despised. That duality is exactly what trauma looks like in real people. It doesn't produce clean, simple outcomes. It produces messy, complicated humans who can be terrible and noble in the same breath. Rowling herself has noted that while Voldemort is psychologically flat, Snape is round. Voldemort stays static in his evil. Snape demonstrates the capacity for growth, for redemption, for choosing differently despite everything that shaped him. Now, let's shift to the other two members of the Golden Trio, because Ron and Hermione are carrying their own psychological weight that often gets overlooked. Hermione Granger likely has obsessive-compulsive tendencies bordering on clinical OCD, coupled with severe anxiety driven by rigid perfectionism. Her boggart, the thing she fears most in the entire world, is Professor McGonagall telling her she's failed all her classes. Think about that. In a world full of dark wizards, death, and dementors, Hermione's deepest fear is academic failure. That's not quirky. That's a window into a mind where self-worth is entirely contingent on achievement. People with rigid perfectionism set unrealistically high standards, fear failure intensely, and treat mistakes not as learning opportunities but as personal catastrophes. Hermione embodies this from her very first appearance on the Hogwarts Express. She's already memorized every textbook. She has to be the first to raise her hand. She takes on an impossible course load in Prisoner of Azkaban using a time turner, because the idea of not taking every available class is psychologically unbearable to her. But here's the beautiful thing about Hermione's arc. Her anxiety doesn't prevent her from being a hero, it makes her the hero she becomes. Her compulsive preparation, her obsessive research, her inability to leave anything to chance. These are the exact traits that keep Harry and Ron alive year after year. Her psychology is both her greatest weakness and her greatest strength. Ron Weasley, meanwhile, is one of the most psychologically honest characters in all of fiction. And that's not a small thing to say. Ron's entire arc is built on an inferiority complex so textbook that Alfred Adler himself could have written it. Adler was the psychologist who argued that the feeling of being less than everyone around you is one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior, and Ron is basically his case study brought to life. He's the sixth of 7 children. Bill was head boy and works at Gringotts. Charlie was Quidditch captain and works with dragons. Percy was head boy and went into the ministry. Fred and George are brilliantly inventive. Ginny is the beloved only daughter, popular, athletic, and special. Ron has no niche. He has nothing. He exists in the shadow of everyone around him, including his best friend, who happens to be the most famous wizard alive. The Mirror of Erised proves this definitively. Harry sees his dead family because he's never known love. Ron sees himself standing alone, the best of all his siblings, because his deepest desire is to be recognized as exceptional at something, anything. That's not vanity, that's a cry from someone who has been psychologically invisible his entire life. Ron's jealousy throughout the series, his blow-up in Goblet of Fire, his abandonment in Deathly Hallows, these aren't character flaws. They're the predictable psychological consequences of chronic invisibility with a family system. When you grow up never feeling seen, you develop compensatory humor to earn attention, shame-based responses to perceived failure, and periodic withdrawal when the pain of comparison becomes too much. Ron's imposter syndrome is so severe that he attributes every accomplishment to luck or someone else's skill. He literally cannot internalize his own competence. Now, let's talk about the man pulling all the strings, Albus Dumbledore. Rowling herself called him Machiavellian, and in psychology, Machiavellianism is a specific personality trait characterized by manipulativeness, indifference to morality, lack of empathy, and a calculated focus on self-interest. It's the third corner of the dark triad, and when you apply that lens to Dumbledore, the kindly grandfather image starts to crack. Dumbledore raises Harry like a lamb for slaughter. He knows from the beginning that Harry must die to destroy Voldemort's Horcrux, and he orchestrates events accordingly. He withholds information. He arranges relationships. He places a child in an abusive home and justifies it with blood magic protection. He brought the Weasley family into Harry's life, a compassionate act on the surface, but also a calculated one. He was arranging lives according to his vision, and these are not the actions of a kindly grandfather figure. These are the actions of a brilliant strategist who has decided that the ends justify the means. The psychology behind Dumbledore's manipulation runs deeper than strategy. Before he became Hogwarts headmaster, young Albus Dumbledore fell under the spell of Gellert Grindelwald, and their shared obsession with the greater good nearly turned Dumbledore into the very thing he later spent his life fighting. The two of them spent a summer designing plans for wizard supremacy, drunk on their own brilliance, and it took the death of Dumbledore's sister, Ariana, in a three-way duel to snap him out of it. That guilt never left him. Psychologists would recognize it as moral injury, a concept originally studied in combat veterans, the lasting psychological damage caused by actions that violate a person's own moral code. Dumbledore carried the knowledge that his ambition contributed to his sister's death for over a century, and that wound shaped every decision he made afterward. His willingness to sacrifice others for the greater good was, paradoxically, an attempt to atone for the one time he pursued the greater good for selfish reasons. He became the chess master precisely because he no longer trusted himself to act on personal desire. Every calculated move, every withheld truth, every piece on the board moved at arm's length. All of it was Dumbledore's way of keeping his own dangerous impulses in check, while still fighting the war he knew was coming. And here's what makes Dumbledore truly unsettling from a psychological perspective. He and Voldemort are more alike than most fans want to admit. Both display dark triad traits. Both manipulate others toward their own ends. The only distinction is that Dumbledore is motivated by good and Voldemort is not. That's it. The methodology is identical. Now, let's talk about a kid who never got the chance to think for himself. Draco Malfoy is what happens when narcissism is taught rather than innate. His arrogance, his cruelty, his obsession with blood purity. None of this originates from within him. It's installed by authoritarian parents who are Death Eaters. Draco displays pathological narcissism, but behind that mask of vanity hides a deep fear of humiliation and irrelevance. When he's actually faced with the reality of what the Death Eaters do, when he's ordered to kill Dumbledore, he can't do it. Because unlike Voldemort, Draco doesn't lack empathy. He was a manipulated boy experiencing cognitive dissonance as his inherited belief system collapsed under the weight of reality. And then there's the character who represents what Draco could have become if he'd never hesitated. Bellatrix Lestrange shows what happens when fanaticism replaces identity entirely. Her devotion to Voldemort goes far beyond loyalty. It functions like an addiction, complete with euphoric highs during acts of violence and a total collapse of selfhood outside of his approval. Psychologists studying cult dynamics would recognize the pattern immediately. Bellatrix surrendered her individual identity to a charismatic authority figure so completely that she could no longer distinguish between his goals and her own desires. Where Draco flinched, Bellatrix leaned in. She tortured Neville's parents into permanent insanity without a flicker of remorse, laughed while killing her own cousin Sirius, and treated murder like performance art. The clinical read is that Bellatrix displays traits of dependent personality disorder, fused with sadistic tendencies, a combination where cruelty becomes the primary vehicle for earning validation from the person she's psychologically fused to. Remove Voldemort from the equation and Bellatrix has nothing. Her entire identity collapses into a void where a person should be. But trauma doesn't only build villains. Neville Longbottom is the character who proves that psychology isn't destiny. His parents were tortured into permanent incapacitation. He was raised by a grandmother who loved him but constantly compared him to his father, creating such intense pressure that his own family feared he might be a squib. He was traumatized by Snape and potions so severely that Snape was literally his boggart. He used a mismatched wand that handicapped his magical development for years. And yet, Neville's story becomes a masterclass in what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, the concept where individuals find genuine strength through surviving trauma. His visits to his parents at St. Mungo's, quietly accepting his mother's vacant gestures, keeping the candy wrappers she hands him rather than discarding them. That's resilience built through small, consistent acts of agency. By the end of the series, this boy who couldn't remember a password pulls the sword of Gryffindor from the sorting hat and kills Nagini. That transformation tracks with documented psychology. And then there's the character who had his growth stolen from him entirely. Sirius Black survived Azkaban through what amounts to a psychological loophole. Most prisoners lost their minds because the Dementors drained every happy memory. But Sirius held on to something the Dementors couldn't touch: the knowledge of his own innocence. His innocence worked as a cold, factual anchor, and when even that wasn't enough, he transformed into Padfoot, because a dog's emotional landscape is less complex, making it harder for Dementors to detect. That's clever world building and a textbook survival mechanism wrapped into one. But Sirius emerged from 12 years of imprisonment with arrested development, depression, and institutionalization effects that couldn't be healed simply by reuniting with Harry. He was reckless because part of him was still the young man who entered Azkaban. The prison took years from him he never could reclaim. This is why Sirius treats Harry less like a godson and more like a replacement for James. Psychologically, Sirius is still operating from the emotional framework of a 21-year-old who lost his best friend overnight. He wants to relive the Marauders era through Harry, suggesting reckless plans, treating serious danger like an adventure, and bristling at anyone who tries to keep Harry safe through caution rather than action. Molly Weasley sees that clearly through their argument at Grimmauld Place. She accuses Sirius of confusing Harry with James, and she's clinically correct. Sirius has transferred his attachment from the dead friend to the living son, and the emotional register hasn't matured at all in the 12 years between. His confinement in Grimmauld Place, the house he grew up hating, only made the regression worse. Being trapped in his childhood home with everyone else fought the war recreated the powerlessness of Azkaban in miniature. Now let's talk about someone who didn't need Azkaban or dark magic to become terrifying. Dolores Umbridge is the character fans hate more than Voldemort, and there's a clinical reason for that. Voldemort is a Dark Lord, distant, theatrical, almost mythological. Umbridge is your worst teacher, your worst boss, your worst bureaucrat wrapped in a pink cardigan and a sweet little cough that somehow feels more threatening than a killing curse. Her evil is mundane, and that's exactly what makes it unbearable. The clinical diagnosis here is narcissistic personality disorder with sadistic features, and Umbridge wears it like one of her horrible pink bows. The narcissism shows in her absolute conviction that she is always cosmically, unquestionably right. She doesn't question herself, ever, about anything. The woman sent Dementors after a 15-year-old and slept fine that night. The sadistic side shows up in her detentions, the kind where the punishment leaves a mark, and she sits across the desk sipping tea like nothing's happening. That's someone who genuinely enjoys watching people beneath her suffer, and Umbridge considers basically everyone beneath her. Half-breeds, half-giants, centaurs, werewolves, students who talk back, and probably whoever designed a chair she didn't find comfortable enough. Psychologists studying authoritarian personalities would have a field day with her. She doesn't break rules, she writes new ones specifically designed to crush people, then enforces them with a smile and a cat plate watching them from the wall. The Dark Lord had to split his soul 7 times to become the most feared wizard alive. Umbridge just needed a clipboard and a ministry seal, and honestly, that's scarier. After all that darkness, let's talk about someone who found a completely different way to survive. Luna Lovegood. She lost her mother at age 9 and processed that grief by developing what appears to be a deeply divergent thinking style. She believes in creatures no one else can see and conspiracy theories that make her classmates call her loony. But Luna represents something psychologists rarely celebrate: authentic selfhood maintained under social pressure. She never pretends to be someone she's not. She never changes to fit in. In a series full of characters wrapped by trauma into masks and personas, Luna's refusal to perform normalcy is its own form of psychological health. Now, one character rarely gets the psychological spotlight, and that's Rubeus Hagrid. Expelled from Hogwarts at 13, stripped of his wand, and has credibility in a single stroke, Hagrid spent decades living on the margins of a world that had branded him dangerous based on a lie. His response to that rejection is psychologically remarkable. Radical empathy extended to every creature the wizarding world deems monstrous. Dragons, acromantulas, hippogriffs, blast-ended scroots. Hagrid loves the things nobody else will love, because he knows what it feels like to be classified as a threat when you're really just different. His attachment to dangerous creatures mirrors his own experience of being misunderstood and punished for something beyond his control. And his fierce unconditional loyalty to Dumbledore, the one authority figure who gave him a home and a purpose after his expulsion, fits the attachment pattern perfectly. Dumbledore showed Hagrid that he mattered, and Hagrid never forgot it, carrying that loyalty through every danger that Sirius threw at him. Now, if you think a wizard's mind is fragile, wait until you find out what if muggles fought the wizarding world. That's your next lesson here at Stickman Hogwarts. Click now before Umbridge makes clicking a punishable offense.